It is Sunday, the 13th of August, 2017. Perhaps a less than lucky Sunday the 13th for the Unitarian Church of Montreal, because, here I am once again starting up my alternative spiritual practice of protesting against Unitarian Universalist injustices, abuses, and hypocrisy. And I should mention that in mid-July, I left a phone message with new UUA President, Reverend Susan Frederick Gray, telling her that I was prepared to suspend my protest for the rest of July and all of August if she agreed to enter into dialogue with me towards the end of resolving the conflict. Well, I haven't heard boo from Reverend Susan Frederick Gray since I left that phone message with her. I tried calling back to follow up several times. Every time I called back later in July and in early August, her answering machine or answering service was full. It was not possible to leave a message. I called at least 3 times, maybe 4 times, possibly 5, but certainly an absolute minimum of 3 times where I called to follow up on that phone message to try and persuade Reverend Susan Frederick Gray that it was in the best interest of the Unitarian Universalist religious community to enter into dialogue with me towards the end of resolving this conflict. And it was impossible to leave a message. The answering machine or the answering service was not properly tended by the assistant to the president who handles it. I was finally able to get through early last week. I can't remember the exact day or date off the top of my head. But again, it was through the messaging machine. So finally they had cleared the messages and it was possible to leave a message again. So I left another message. I still haven't heard from Reverend Susan Frederick Gray, the new president of the Unitarian Universalist Association. So my protest outside the Unitarian Church of Montreal continues, and it will continue indefinitely. I have always been prepared to suspend the protest for a minimum of 2 months if either Montreal Unitarians locally, and actually predominantly that, all of my previous offers to suspend the protest for a couple of months, and sometimes even 3 months, were to leaders of the Unitarian Church of Montreal, mainly presidents of the board of the Unitarian Church of Montreal. All of these offers were ignored and thus rejected. So when it comes down to it, I believe my phone call to Reverend Susan Frederick Gray is the first time that I'd offered to suspend my protest in front of the Unitarian Church of Montreal to the Unitarian Universalist Association itself. And the Unitarian Universalist Association is most certainly part of the problem here. The Unitarian Universalist Association is responsible for disciplining Unitarian Universalist ministers, and it has failed miserably to do that when I have brought legitimate complaints against Unitarian Universalist ministers, specifically Reverend Ray Drennan and Reverend Dr. Victoria Weinstein, also known as Peace Bang. I filed complaints against both of these ministers for what can be properly described as verbally and psychologically abusive behavior, and not just towards me. In the case of Reverend Ray Drennan, the complaint was just about behavior that he directed at me, but he later directed similar behavior at other people, including former Prime Minister of Canada, Pierre Elliott Trudeau, who unfortunately wasn't alive to hear Reverend Ray Drennan's intolerant and abusive diatribe against the fact that his state funeral was a Roman Catholic religious service. But nonetheless, Reverend Ray Drennan most certainly has behaved abusively towards other people, and so has Reverend Dr. Victoria Weinstein. And my complaint against Reverend Dr. Victoria Weinstein actually included complaints about her attacks on various other people besides myself. These were dismissed out of hand by the UUA. They pretended that Reverend Ray Drennan's abusive conduct, as I described it in considerable detail, was within the appropriate guidelines of ministerial leadership. That's an exact quote, or very close to exact quote, from the letter they sent me dismissing my complaint. And then in the case of Reverend Victoria Weinstein, they actually took a different tack, like almost a complete opposite tack. They said that Reverend Victoria Weinstein's abusive behavior, which they did not recognize as being abusive at all, was outside of her role as a minister because it was on her blog. In other words, they said, well, this is on her blog, so it's got nothing to do with her ministry, which is just, you know, ridiculous, really. This was very public. Her blog introduction clearly identified her as a Unitarian Universalist minister of a Unitarian Universalist church in New England, although not which one specifically. It was clearly part of her ministry, and certainly reflected on her ministry, not only her ministry, but basically the ministry of every other Unitarian Universalist minister, at least the ones in New England, because it wasn't clear which New England Unitarian Universalist minister Peace Bang was, and so people could have been guessing, well, you know, who is this abusive minister? Which one is it? They could have been speculating about a good number of other Unitarian Universalist ministers, because Reverend Dr. Weinstein blogged pseudonymously and essentially anonymously under the moniker of Peace Bang. So those complaints were dismissed, and I was actually later threatened with criminal charges by the Unitarian Universalist Association in its efforts to intimidate me into removing blog posts that criticized Reverend Dr. Victoria Weinstein's abusive behavior, specifically her obscene and sadistic sodomy fantasy, which imagined South Dakota State Senator Bill Napoli anally impaled on the Statue of Liberty's torch. Again, that's a very exact quote, pretty well a word-for-word quote from Reverend Dr. Victoria Weinstein's blog post, in which she fantasized about having a Republican state senator anally impaled on the Statue of Liberty's torch. But another part of that letter, in fact the final paragraph, or penultimate paragraph, falsely accused me of violating Canada's blasphemy law for allegedly making unfounded and vicious allegations to the effect that ministers of the association engage in such despicable crimes as pedophilia and rape. Again, that's a very exact quote from the cease and desist demand letter that I was served with in June of 2012, just over 5 years ago. So the Unitarian Universalist Association, via its Canadian attorney, Stikeman Elliott Barristers and Solicitors Litigation Lawyer, Maitre Marc-André Coulombe, was accusing me of the criminal act of blasphemous libel. That is essentially the term used in Canada's blasphemy law, which I believe is about to be repealed if it hasn't already been repealed. I'm very happy that the new Justin Trudeau government, under the leadership of the new Justice Minister, Wilson Raybould, I'm trying to remember her first name. In any case, her nickname is Puglass. But yes, it's Minister Wilson Raybould. Her first name's escaping me. She tabled a bill which included repeal of quite a number of laws, but including Canada's archaic and incredibly vague and open to abuse blasphemy law. So anyhow, this was the Unitarian Universalist Association misusing Canada's blasphemy law in legal bullying that was clearly intended to cover up and hide such despicable crimes as pedophilia and rape committed by certain Unitarian Universalist ministers, specifically Reverend Mac Wallace Mitchell of the Northborough and Westborough parishes in Massachusetts. He was the only Unitarian Universalist minister who I actually named as a rapist, because he was charged, tried, and convicted of the forcible rape and even the unnatural rape. I'm sure you can figure out what that's about, of teenage Tibetan refugees who he had lured away from their families in India with promises of a better life in America. He essentially, told their parents, if you give your, daughters into my care, I will take them back to America and I will see to it that they get a proper education and everything. And, essentially he said he would, be a father to them, essentially, and ensure that they were properly cared for, got a good education, and possibly even promised them American citizenship. Although that I'm not sure about, but that is sort of hinted at by some statements made by the Unitarian Universalist Association in their sanitized version of events. The other Unitarian Universalist, who I described as a pedophile rapist, indeed the only Unitarian Universalist who I described as a pedophile rapist, or even a pedophile at all, was Richard Buell of First Parish Norwell, who just happened to be a parishioner of Reverend Dr. Victoria Weinstein, also known as Peace Bang. So Peace Bang is doubly involved in this legal bullying because she's involved in the false accusation that I'm guilty of sexual harassment of her, indeed threatening and defamatory conduct amounting to sexual harassment of Reverend Dr. Victoria Weinstein. Again, another quote from the demand letter, for criticizing her obscene and sadistic sodomy fantasy in which she imagined South Dakota State Senator Bill Napoli anally impaled on the Statue of Liberty's torch. Seems to me that Reverend Dr. Victoria Weinstein's sodomy fantasy can be properly described as threatening and defamatory conduct amounting to sexual harassment of Republican State Senator Bill Napoli, much more justifiably than my legitimate criticism of Reverend Dr. Victoria Weinstein's conduct unbecoming a minister, to say the very least, can be described as, in the same words, threatening and defamatory conduct amounting to sexual harassment of Reverend Dr. Victoria Weinstein. So just a complete perversion of justice by the Unitarian Universalist Association, and I think, that word perversion of justice is very, very appropriate. I mean, it's appropriate in general terms, obviously, but I think it's specifically appropriate when one considers that the legal bullying that the Unitarian Universalist Association engaged in was intended to conceal what could be reasonably described as perversion on the part of Unitarian Universalist ministers, and of course Richard Buell. So the Unitarian Universalist Association, after falsely accusing me of blasphemous libel and threatening and defamatory conduct amounting to sexual harassment of women Unitarian Universalist ministers, including Reverend Dr. Victoria Weinstein, they were told in no uncertain terms that those accusations were highly misleading or outright false in the case of the blasphemous libel accusation, and that I expected the Unitarian Universalist Association to formally withdraw those false accusations, especially the blasphemous libel accusation, to properly and publicly apologize for bringing those false accusations against me, and to publicly disclose the truth about exactly how many Unitarian Universalist ministers, to say nothing of Unitarian Universalist Sunday school teachers, also known as religious educators, are in fact guilty of committing such despicable crimes as pedophilia and rape. Because I can assure you that Reverend Mac Wallace Mitchell is by no means the only Unitarian Universalist minister to have been charged, tried, and convicted of the sexual abuse of children. In fact, some Unitarian Universalist ministers have been charged, tried, and convicted of the sexual abuse of very young children. And others have been accused of the sexual abuse of young children, but haven't, to the best of my knowledge, ever faced criminal charges. But they've certainly been accused of it by other people. But there's been at least a few cases that I'm aware of where Unitarian Universalist ministers have been charged, tried, and convicted of what the Unitarian Universalist Association's Canadian attorney, Maître Marc-André Coulombe, describes as such despicable crimes as pedophilia and rape. And I am convinced that, you know, what I know about is by no means all of it. You know, what I know about are some very specific cases where, as I said, people were charged, tried, and convicted. I also know some other cases where people were accused, but were not actually, you know, arrested and charged and so on, but they were certainly accused of rape or sexual assault or even sexual abuse of children. And in fact, in one case, the source claimed that a lesbian Unitarian Universalist minister was a pedophile who was actually interested in infants even. You know, that is an unconfirmed accusation, but it is an accusation that, you know, one person divulged to me. They did not identify the minister in question, but nonetheless, that is an accusation that I've heard directly from another person who seemed to, you know, be aware of that particular situation. So there's really no question that a certain number of Unitarian Universalist ministers are in fact guilty of such despicable crimes as pedophilia and rape, whether or not they were actually charged, tried, and convicted of such despicable crimes as pedophilia and rape. And the Unitarian Universalist Association has stubbornly, indeed quite obstinately, refused to do what I asked: remove the false accusations formally, apologize for them publicly, and tell the truth about how many of their ministers are guilty of pedophilia and rape. So